Good day and greetings from Pretoria, South Africa. My name is Dr. Charles Cotter. I'm the Learning Navigator of the Change Management and Leadership in a Crisis online learning program, part of the e-learning series. This is an on-demand learning program and comprises of 6 modules. Each of the registered learners will receive a SlideShare presentation per module, and then also a detailed workbook which comprises the content, but also a series of learning activities, which I'll expect you to complete at the end of each of these modules. I think this is probably the best way of continuing the engagement and also to stimulate discussion between the Learning Navigator and the registered learners. As a form of introduction, I'd like to give you a quick overview of my professional pedigree. Essentially, I've been in the field of education, training, and development for the last 19 years. Of those 19, 15 as an independent contractor. I've been very privileged to have worked for over 140 different companies, both in the public and private sector. And of course, this stretches across 18 different countries and 4 different continents. My area of subject matter expertise is strategic management, change management, and also strategic human resources management. Looking at outcome 2, which is looking at the ProSo model, which is a more contemporary and more modern model to change management processes. And then we're going to conclude module 4 by looking at the third outcome, and that is to unpack case study number 2. Let's continue then with module 4. So we've already looked at 3 organizational change management modules, and we looked at Kurt Lewin's model, we looked at John Cotter's model. Kurt Lewin's model, like we said, dates back to the 1950s, John Cotter, the 1990s, and then the organizational behavior model, which is the turn of the century, 2000. But a more modern approach, I would say from around about 2013, so certainly generating a lot of research intelligence, of course, is the ProSo model, which is a more modern model to change management. And I'd like us to look at that. So let's start off with point number 1. So ProSo do suggest that change management is 2-dimensional. It can be seen from an individual, but also an organizational perspective. I think the mistake that a lot of organizations make is to fixate on the organizational change management variables, and sometimes we neglect the individual. And we did say, based on the ProSo research, that the cooperation, the engagement, the involvement, consultation with employees is very important. In fact, a critical success factor. So the second point, and we're going to get to the model later on, is one of the tools that ProSo have provided to us is the ADKAR toolkit that they've provided. And they suggest that it's an acronym which stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And we're going to get to that shortly. But this is certainly a very user-friendly model that we could use to implement individual change. And then, of course, from an organizational perspective, we need to look at the 3-phased approach. So you'll see, again, a very strong overlap with Kurt Lewin's model, John Cotter's model, etc. I think you'll recognize that these organizational change models are very similar. Semantics, you might argue, different terminology. But the process steps, the process map, generally, there's a strong resemblance between these different models. And I think it's up to you as an organizational change leader. It's up to your organization to make a decision which one is best suited, is best fit. Because I think, again, it brings us back to the debate, best practice versus best fit. I think ProSo at the moment would be best practice, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to be best fit, that it's going to work in all organizations and with the same degree of organizational success. So these 3 points, very clear here. There's a clear divide. There's individual. So the individual, ProSo have given us the ADKAR acronym, which we can then use as a toolkit. But then when we look at it from an organizational perspective, they've given us a 3-step process. So let's look at that process. So at the individual level, and this is again an alternative tool that you could use to break down potential resistance to change, to win people over and to get them to fluently implement the change management process and plan. So you'll see it does start with awareness, and you'll recall Cotter's techniques of how to break down resistance to change. He did suggest that strategy number one is education and awareness, very important. The participation, which would be step number two, but awareness, yeah, and I think you'll agree with me, this awareness is the need for change. And you'll recall when we looked at module one, it was the very first outcome that we looked at. We need to pinpoint the need for change. It can't just be a case of changing for the sake of changing. There must be a definitive business case, and these driving forces, both internal and externally, what is the need for change? So typically the question that is related to that is, why do I have to do things differently? And then you'll recall from the change transition cycle, this is typically the question that people ask during the initial stages of the change announcement: the shock, the denial, the fear, the apprehension, the uncertainty. And of course, people are often in their comfort zone. And you'll recall we did look at that during module 2 as well. The comfort zone, this is where the magic happens. And of course, looking at the 4 different developmental zones: the comfort zone, the fear zone, we have to break through that threshold, getting ultimately to the learning and the growth zone. And that's really the playing field of change leadership. And that's really probably the differentiation between successful change and change failure. The D then stands for desire. So we need to create this desire. Like Cotter said, this is now the facilitation and support. This is very similar to those strategies: support and participate, carve that kind of involvement, engagement in the change process. And again, typically at the individual level, the question that people will ponder is, why would I want to do things differently? So if there's no definitive response, there's no reward, there's no benefits to the change. You'll recall the Noster model that we looked at in module 1, where we looked at those 5 critical success factors of change. One of them, of course, was incentives. We need to incentivize change. So I think a lot of these models can be integrated into a collective model, which would then probably be a best fit model. The K then stands for knowledge. Knowledge of how to change. And you'll remember from the Noster model that I just alluded to, I think the skills is very important, seems to be a critical success factor. If people don't have the right skills, then I think the change management processes are jeopardized. So the question there, what additional skills do I need to do things differently? We mentioned in module 1, it's really a case of business unusual. During a time of crisis, during a time of second order, whitewater rapids change, I think it's very important that we empower. That's why change leadership is so important. Tools like mentoring and coaching, very useful tools. Talent development strategies need to really kick in, and we need to really upskill and empower the team members to equip them with the skills so they can build their confidence. And with the confidence will come the commitment. The ability to implement the right skills and behaviors. So it's no use giving the workforce the tools and the toolkit if you don't give them the roadmap, if you don't give them the user manual, the instruction manual on how to utilize those tools. And I think the key word there is behavior. I think the commonly used formula for competency equals knowledge plus skills plus attributes, those behavioral competencies, those personality traits, the values that we mentioned earlier that are so important. And I think it's very important here, apart from being an innovative solutions architect, as a change leader, you also then have to become a behavioral economist. You have to have the ability to recognize the appropriate behaviors and be decisive and intervene when you observe dysfunctional behavior, which contradicts the core value system and the change management golden thread, which is going to lead to successful implementation. So the question here is, can I actually do things differently? So this is all about self-belief. And apart from building the agility and building this resilience and this change fitness, future fitness, think the self-belief is maybe a very important soft skill that has to be inculcated, and we have to try to instill this kind of self-belief amongst our team members. And very similar to Kurt Lewin, very similar to what John Cotter is saying, the final process, of course, is the reinforcement. This is to make change stick, to sustain the change. I think it's very important. And then, of course, typically employees would ask, how do I get the support to maintain a different way of doing things? And again, if we don't provide that support system, if we don't provide that safety net, if we don't reward the behaviors that we see exhibited, which then contribute and enable the achievement of the change goals, then of course the change will not stick. So the reinforcement is very important. So this is a very useful model at ADKAR. Again, like we said, it focuses on individual level. So we've got to create this awareness, this desire, the knowledge, the ability, and the reinforcement. And this, of course, will lead to a seamless change management process. So let's look at it from an organizational perspective, and you'll see again a very strong parallel between what the other change management theorists are suggesting. Phase 1, not surprising, preparation for change. Phase 2, the management of change. Phase 3, the reinforcement of change. So what we're going to look at very shortly is we're going to look at how we can unpack the key process steps in each of these 3 phases, and then see again from a learning activity perspective whether this is certainly best practice, but is it best fit in your organization? So let's continue with the ProSo model. So like we said, the 3 phases: preparation, management, and reinforcement of change. So let's unpack each of these 3 phases so that we can identify what the process steps are. Let's start with phase 1. Phase 1 comprises of 3 process steps. First of all, we need to define the change management strategy. I think similar to the other models of change, this is the genesis of the change management process. We have to initially start with the preparation of the key change management team. That's very important. Then, of course, develop the sponsorship model, which is then the 3rd process step, which is the culmination of phase 1 of the change management process. And you'll recall from the ProSo research that they did say the #1 critical success factor is top management sponsorship. If we don't have the support, the buy-in, and the resource allocation from top management, then I'm afraid to say change management is unlikely to be effective. When we get to phase 2 of the change management process, you'll see that this is now where we have to go from this vision, this blueprint, this high-level strategy. We have to cascade it down to, at an operational level, the change management plan. And the plan, we said it previously, a good template for any plan is to use the 4 whiskeys in a hotel. So that's the what. So we need to formulate what are the change management objectives. The how, what are the specific process steps that need to be taken. We need to look at the who. So we need to allocate and assign specific responsibility for the execution, the implementation of each of these key process steps. And of course, a very important part of any operational change plan is the when. So we need to attach a specific target date for the completion of each of these process steps. So it's the what, it's the how, it's the who, the when, and then even your more sophisticated change management strategies would have the additional W, and that's of course the weight. So they'll have a key performance indicator. How well must each of those key performance tasks be performed? So I think this is a very good tool that you could use. And again, if you're using a balanced business scorecard methodology, I think it ties up very nicely. As I said previously on this module, the OTMI, objectives, targets, measures, and initiatives. And of course, it gives you a quantitative yardstick against which you can measure whether the change management process, those process steps have been implemented effectively. And then, of course, logically, once you've solidified and you cemented and concretized the change management plan, what culminates phase 2 is then the actual implementation of that plan. So you have to transition to action. You have to activate the change management plan. And that, of course, then is the conclusion of phase 2 of the process. So you recall phase 1 comprises of 3 process steps. Phase 2 comprises of 2 process steps. And then we conclude by looking at phase 3. So if you add it all up, which also has 3 process steps, you have a total of 8, which is very similar to Cotter's 8-step model. So I think you'll recognize that there's a very strong overlap. Phase 3, as we said, is reinforcing change. So this is the management control cycle that we spoke about. We need to collect and analyze performance intelligence and feedback. So we need to use a multi-rater system. We need to use what we call 360-degree, or more modern term is crowdsourced performance intelligence. So we need to get input and feedback from the various key stakeholders. You'll see later on in this program, we're going to look at developing the power interest matrix, and of course, your key stakeholders who have a high degree of power and interest. I think they'll be very influential in whether your change management program succeeds or not. Also, the diagnosis of the gaps, any kind of resistance to change. Again, I think you might recall Cotter's managerial techniques. At this point, we're quite far advanced in the change management process. And if we anticipate that there's any resistance to change, do the root cause analysis, identify and pinpoint the reasons for resistance. Is it self-interest? Is it just people are stuck in a comfort zone? Is it the management culture which is resisting a change? And then, of course, where we do identify those gaps, we need to implement the corrective or remedial actions. And as Cotter has repeatedly said, milestone management, celebrate success. So we sometimes as change leaders, we fixate on the nuts and bolts of change management. Nothing wrong with that. But also where there is success, don't be afraid to recognize, don't be afraid to acknowledge, don't be afraid to celebrate success. I think it's good for motivation. And remember, this will not be the last change management project in your organization. In fact, this is not a linear process. This is a cyclical process. This could be the start of the next change cycle. The next wave of change could start with the end of phase 3. So 3-phase process, ProSci, and of course, they've broken down each of the 3 phases into a total of 8 process steps. Gives us a very good roadmap that we can use. Beauty of this, tried and tested, evidence-based, global research, can't go wrong. Also, the beauty of the ProSo model is that it now gives us a correlation between some of the typical change management tools, which you'll see is the left-hand column, and then it corresponds that with the ADKAR model that we just looked at. So that's the awareness, the desire, the knowledge, the ability, and the reinforcement. And it creates quite a complicated, a very intricate network, and you're welcome to follow those arrows, but maybe we could just look at 1 or 2 examples where you could see, for example, the toolkit that you have communication. You should have a good communication strategy, good change management communication strategy that runs parallel with the change management process. Your sponsorship roadmap, we said that's very important, especially your top management, your middle management. They tend to be the kingpins of the change management process. Your coaching plan, we said, very important. We need to empower, we need to engage, but we need to invest in the development of the employees throughout the change management process. We need to have a developmental mindset when it comes to change management process. Change resistance, We know that. We've discussed that at great length. You need to have a resistance management strategy. You can employ the 7 techniques of Cotter, starting with education and communication. Again, participation, facilitation, cooptation, coercion, negotiation, and then ultimately coercion. So we're familiar with that. And of course, training. Training is always going to be a very useful, complementary, very supportive tool. So if you look at communication, that of course links up directly. You see the direct arrow from communication through to the awareness, and you'll see there's also an arrow that runs from communication down to reinforcement. So I think that just gives you an idea. So communication strategy should be two-pronged. It should be twofold. It should focus on the awareness, building the awareness, creating the awareness. So again, like we said with previous modules, doing those road shows, using your internet, the voice of change, very important, high degree of visibility, catalyst leaders, transformational leaders, very important that we walk the talk, but also it's there as a reinforcement tool. So to make the change stick, to refreeze, as Kurt Lewin would say, the change. The other example maybe that I could look at right at the bottom is training. And again, you'll see that's a two-dimensional training that links with knowledge. And I think you'll agree with me, knowledge, creating knowledge, broking, I think it's very important, and also ability. So skills development and knowledge broking are very important as we relate that to ADKAR. So training and your coaching plan, you'll see, is also very useful for that in stimulating the knowledge, creating this knowledge management system, which is very useful. So at the culmination, at the end of the change management process, I think a smart strategy is to capture all of the lessons learned from the change management process. And this, of course, becomes part of your knowledge management system. This is what the best practice organizations are doing. They're calling themselves smart or intelligent enterprises. And of course, one of the critical success factors is to have a knowledge management system. So coaching is there, resistance management especially, you'll see how that links up directly with desire. So if you can't create this compelling vision, this want to change, like we said with the previous modules, we should create a culture of commitment and not necessarily a culture of compliance. Because if you have a culture of compliance, then I think it results in just intensifying your resistance management strategies. So I'd like to solidify the ProSo model and the toolkit, etc., by completing learning activity 10. Like I said, you will find this in workbook 4. And there's just the one question that relates to the ProSo model. Again, similar to the other organizational change management models, what I'd like you to look at is the merits, the application, utility value. Does it have functional value in your organization? So the business case, is it viable? Is it feasible? Is it sustainable? And of course, when you come to a conclusion, I'd like you to justify and substantiate either way. Yes, there is a business case for implementing the ProSo model, and elaborate on that. And conversely, if there's no business case, what would be the drawbacks? What would be the shortcomings of this particular model? Why would it not be a best for change management model, which can then impact positively both on individual but also organizational change? Again, maybe a 3 to 4 page essay would be adequate, just to share your thoughts and your insights, and just to do a thorough diagnosis and analysis of the ProSo Change Management model. Again, send that to me by means of email, and then of course we can continue the learning engagement by means of this.
This is Charles Cotter signing out. I'd like to thank you for watching the video clip, Change Management and Leadership in a Crisis online learning program. Please be on the lookout for subsequent uploads on my YouTube learning channel of the other modules. Also, please have a look at the chat box section. You'll see in the comment section. If you'd like to access a copy of the workbook in PDF format, I'll gladly email that to you for this specific module, but also the other modules of the various video clips. I'd also like to remind you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please press the notification bell to be alerted of the subsequent uploads of the other modules, and also like to encourage you to reach out and contact me. My contact details and social media presence will be provided on the screen very shortly, so I'd encourage you to reach out. And of course, I would welcome any sort of communication or feedback regarding this video clip or any other learning content on my YouTube learning channel. Thank you. I appreciate your ongoing interest and active social media support. Thank you. You keep well. Bye-bye.